Well, we have been in a series in the book of Ephesians called Beautiful. We're looking at the character of God. We've looked at the generosity of God. We've looked at the wisdom of God. We've looked at the creativity of God. Last week, the message was called A God of All Hope, and we looked at the hope that we have in and because of Jesus. And this week, we're going to move on to the grace of God. I want to just think about for a minute with you at this season when we're going to holiday parties, when we're seeing family, when we're seeing friends that we haven't seen in a while. Oftentimes I'll meet someone and there's just like an outstanding characteristic of that person. Have you ever met someone who there's just one thing that really stands out about that person? We were last night at a holiday party with the Lowers. This Rob Lower's probably with his kids. He's not. I'm going to sell him out right this second, and he's not even in here to experience it. We were at a holiday party, and I sat between Rob Lower and his little girl, Matea, who's like one something. I think she's 1.5 or something like that. And Rob, if you know Rob, he's an artist. He's extremely creative. Their house is filled with beautiful paintings that he's done. And so I'm sitting there, we're eating, and he says, I've been teaching Matea animal sounds. And I think, that's cool. That's a cool thing for parents to do. He's like today we're working on the octopus. And I was like, well, I'm a grown man, and I have no idea what noise octopuses make. Like, help me out. And so it's the sucker noise. And he started making this octopus noise, and then his daughter started mimicking him. And he said, yeah, yesterday we did the hippopotamus. And I thought to myself, I have no idea what the hippopotamus noise was. And then he did this incredible whale sound. And I just thought, if you take anything and you mix in Rob, it just gets more creative. He's just creative. When I think of him, I think that guy is creative, and it doesn't matter what you're talking about. He's just creative. I've been thinking this week for some reason about my two brother-in-laws. One of my brother-in-laws is hilarious. Like, he's a jokester, he's a prankster. As an introvert, I like sitting next to him at holiday parties when we're with family because I just have to sit down with some chips and he's just going to tell jokes and it'll be great and we'll laugh. Now, the flip side is if you want to be serious, it doesn't go so well with them. Once in a while, I want to have a serious couples conversation, and it's just like everything is an opportunity for a joke. And sometimes I don't want to hear a joke. I'm like, gah! But he is hilarious. My other brother-in-law is an incredibly beautiful pianist. And he's quiet. He doesn't usually talk to us. But when he sits down at the piano, I'm like, he's a genius. The air just fills with music. Someone recently sent me a YouTube link of a professional British rock band member going to a train station and just sitting down at the piano and playing and a crowd drawing around, and he was just tearing up the piano. But my first reaction was like, Andy's better than that guy. Like, he's an amazing piano player, but my brother-in-law is truly like a genius on the piano. He's incredibly brilliant at the piano. You might have a relative who's, because we're going to holiday parties, just has the gift of criticism. Do you have any relatives like that where if you're feeling a little too puffed up, I should just go talk to them because my flaws will be exposed. It'll be nice. I can just work on humility anytime I want to. I can just talk to them and I'll just have all my flaws right on the table. So that'll be nice. And they're just incredibly, thoroughly, consistently critical. It's just wonderful to have that relative who can play that role all the time in your family. You can see I'm a little bit bitter, but we have another friend named Bobby who's incredibly prophetic. He hears God so well, and came up in a recent conversation I was talking about, and we were talking about Bobby, and someone was like, which Bobby? Prophetic Bobby. Oh, that Bobby. And everybody knows, like, you can't even think of him without thinking like he hears God. And it's really great if you want to have a sense of what God is saying to you, you could go talk to him. Then on the other hand, if you don't want to have a sense of what God's saying to you, it's best to avoid him. And so sometimes, depending on what's going on in my life, I might want to avoid him because it's just so strong. Well, this morning we're going to talk about, I think, the characteristic of God in Ephesians. If we were to lay out, we talked about wisdom, we talked about generosity, we talked about God's creativity. We could talk about many, many qualities of the Lord our God, but the one that is the theme of Ephesians, from the front to the back, actually the very first verse of Ephesians, the first thing that Paul says to the Ephesians is grace to you. The very last thing Paul says to the Ephesians is grace to you. at all the key moments in the book of Ephesians, what Paul wants them to understand is that the Lord our God, who has come to be with us in Jesus, who lived a perfect life and died on the cross for us and was raised from the dead in extraordinary power, is a gracious God. That's the running theme. And this morning, we're going to look at the grace of God. Let's pray and dive into Ephesians 1. Lord, thanks for your grace. And Lord, I ask that you would bring it alive. Wherever grace has become stale, wherever grace has become too familiar, would you restore its power this morning? Would you capture our hearts? Lord, would you open up your love to us in a fresh way? In your name, Jesus. Amen. Well, we're going to be back in Ephesians 1. If you've been following in this series, we've read all these verses before that we're going to see today, but you might have noticed we just haven't paid attention to the word grace. So much of Ephesians 1 is so rich. There's so many layers. It's like a recipe with just many ingredients that are all just distilled and strong. And this morning we're going to highlight grace in these hopefully now getting to be familiar verses. And I want to begin by looking at what I've called the story of grace, because as we look at the grace of God, it's not just a quality, it's not just an adjective, it's not just an aspect of God, it's really the story of what he's done for us. And so here's Ephesians 1, verses 4 to 6. In love, he predestined us for adoption to sonship through Jesus Christ in accordance with his pleasure and will, to the praise of his glorious grace, which he has freely given us in the one he loves. In accordance with his pleasure and will, to the praise of his glorious grace, which he has given us in the one he loves, that is Jesus. And we're going to keep going and unpack this, but this is almost like the opening volley of grace. This is the first thing that the Apostle Paul wants us to know about grace. And as we look at the story of grace this morning, I'm going to give you 3 words about grace that help describe the grace of God. And then we're going to look at really the center of the story of grace as well. But the first word here is right there, freely, to the praise of his glorious grace. Now, grace means a free gift. That's what it means. But Paul immediately says it's given freely. If you were to read the Greek and I was just transliterate, it would be, God gave us a free gift and he's given it freely, which sounds a little bit redundant, doesn't it? Like, what's the point? It's a free gift that's given freely. I think there's a reason that he's emphasizing that grace is free, and I think this is a time of year when we might be able to get in touch with that. I don't know if you've ever had the experience where you are giving Christmas presents to a family member, but they don't give presents back to you. Do you ever have that happen where there's a family member that, like, you give gifts and they don't give them to you, and we start to not want to give them gifts as much? We had a conversation, this is a true story from this week. We were just talking about one of my relatives. What should we get our relatives for Christmas? We're going through, we're thinking of who we're going to get what and what we're going to do. And we got to one of my relatives, and I said, we don't have to get him a gift. They never get us gifts. That's a bad attitude, isn't it? Now you don't want me to be a pastor anymore, right? So I'm arguing against gifts. And then Michelle helpfully points out, well, they did give us a gift last year, but we forgot to send theirs. Then I just felt like a terrible person. Like, I'm just a bad human being. I just made an argument against giving a gift on the basis of lack of reciprocity, when in fact we're the ones who didn't give the gift. Now I just feel bad about myself and about the world, and I want to criticize somebody. But it was a nice moment. But oftentimes when we give gifts, we live in a culture where when we give gifts, there's some expectation that something will be given in return. Reciprocity is underneath it. I think if you're like white Northern European background, you probably have like a small sense of reciprocity. Like, it's nice and kind of important. But my guess is if you're from a more Eastern culture, in this room, a number of us have different East Asian backgrounds, you probably have a stronger sense of reciprocity. You may come from a family tradition where reciprocity is really part of the deal. Like, gift giving is an exchange, and it can almost feel like an obligation. Well, I think even more so than modern Eastern cultures, in the ancient world, gift giving was all about obligation. That's what it was. And you gave a gift in order to obligate the person to give you something when you needed it. And so gift giving was like a strategy. It's kind of like a savings account. Like you give gifts so that when you need help, they're going to give them back to you. And you give some big gifts because you're eventually going to need help. And there's no Bank of America. There's no, savings account. And so you give gifts so that you can obligate them to give you help when you need it. And Paul is saying God is actually totally unlike our cultural system of gift giving. He's totally unlike that. When God gives a free gift, it's freely given. When God gives a free gift, it's strings attached. When God gave his only son to die on the cross, it's not so that we would give back to him or because we could give back to him or because there's any way we could repay it. It's because it's a sheerly loving act on our behalf. It's freely given. And so the first word, if we were going to talk about God's grace is free. It's truly free. It's no strings attached. It's without fee or charge. And even though it means grace is a free gift, we need to sort of reiterate, the free gift is actually free. It's actually no strings attached. And sometimes I think this quality of God is actually a little bit offensive. Because when God's grace, when his great love, when his forgiveness is actually without strings, without any ability to repay, some of us, I think, speaking personally, it puts us in a humble light when there's nothing we can give back. It puts us in that purely open-handed, you have everything, Lord, that I need. And it can strip down some of our desire to be in charge of our lives. And so I think actually God's grace is a reason that sometimes we avoid God. I think one of the reasons that I ran away from God is I wanted to be in charge of my own life. I actually, without thinking it in these many words, wanted to avoid grace because of what grace said about me. And this year at this time is just a great moment to recenter our lives on grace. To say, Lord, you have been loving and lavish, and it's no strings attached, and I receive your grace, Lord. I receive your free grace. Well, let's look at the center of the story of grace. Moving on, just the very next verse from the one we just previously read. In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins, in accordance with the riches of God's grace. The great wealth of God's grace, if we were to translate it literally, that he lavished on us. So another rich verse. This passage, these two verses have a big story in the background. If I were to say to you, particularly this week, if we're outside talking and I say, may the force be with you, right? Calling on my last week. It brings alive a whole story, right? There's a whole story behind that. When I say, may the force be with you, it's like good versus evil, Han Solo, Luke Skywalker, Death Star, all of that. It's all in that phrase, right? Because that phrase has a story that it just refers to and brings alive. If you were reading this and you were in the ancient world and a Jew, in him we have redemption through his blood. The story you would hear very clearly is the Exodus story. Oh, you just brought it alive. Redemption through blood, freedom. He bought our freedom with blood. I know that story. That is, God led his people out of Israel. God took a people who were slaves and he redeemed them by humbling Pharaoh and doing signs and wonders. And at the very end, saying to Israel, put blood over your mantle, and everybody whose door has blood over it, the angel will pass over and you'll be safe, and everybody else. And notice the Egyptians could do it too. It wasn't particular to Israel. Every person who has blood over their doorpost is going to be free of the judgment, and every person who does not will be subject to the judgment of the Lord, and their firstborn will be taken. This verse brings that to mind. Oh, it's the Exodus. But it's the Exodus in a particular way. It's the Exodus fulfilled in Jesus, who died on the cross to set everyone free so that everyone who put their faith in him would be free. and would be set free from the consequences of sin. And it's open to all. So it's the Exodus story told in Jesus, fulfilled on the cross. And that is the heartbeat of grace. And so when we think about grace, we have to remember that the cross is the center of the story of grace. Paul wants us to know that all the promises of God, the promise made to Abraham, the promises God made to Moses, the promises God made to Ruth and to Esther, the promises God made to David and to Solomon and to all these folks in the Old Testament were fulfilled in Jesus, God's only Son. And now that story is getting worked out through the church. It's getting worked out in our lives as we discover the riches of God's grace. But the center point of the whole story is the cross of Jesus. And so when we think about grace, we want to center our lives on the cross. And there's a lot of pictures in grace in our culture, but the cross is where God displays the truth of grace. Like, here's the reality. There's a lot of partial truths. There's a lot of myths about grace, but the reality of grace is found on the cross. Okay. Now, just a couple more words. So if the first thing Paul wants us to know is that grace is free, here's a second kind of word to describe grace. In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins, in accordance with the riches of God's grace. And here's the word, that he lavished on us. So when we think about grace and God's grace, we want to remember that God's grace is lavish. It's free and it's lavish. The Greek word, we're going to learn one Greek word today. This is less common. It's parasuo. Can you say that? Parasuo. It doesn't really sound like an English word. The last one we did was poema. That sounds like, it's kind of nice because it sounds like the word that it is. It's related to poem. Parasuo doesn't really, it's an ancient word. It means to overflow. It means to abound. It means to have extra. If water overflows the banks of a river, it's parasuo. It's overflowing. If there's too many people, if there's a team sport and you have too many people to play so that not all of them are even going to be able to play, that would be parasuo. We've got more than we can possibly use. At a holiday party, have you ever gone to a party where you can bring either sides or desserts and every single person brings desserts and they're all cookies, and so you have 7,000 cookies and 14 people? Has that ever happened? Maybe 6,000, not 7,000. But we're like, now we have cookies until Jesus comes back, actually. There's just cookies. That's parasuo, like way more than we need, more than we could eat. It's not like everybody has enough and gets some extra and it's nice and you're full. It's like ridiculous. Actually, in the ancient world, it was oftentimes like a negative word, like way more than you need. Just more than makes sense. That's the word. God's grace is lavish. It's more than we could ever need. It's more than enough. It means when the Son of God came to die on the cross and buy our freedom, it was more than enough for everything we'll ever need, no matter what. It's still more. It's more than all of us will ever need. God's grace is lavish. It abounds past the furthest reach of our needs. I'm really happy about that word because I don't know about you, but sometimes I feel like I am stuck in a rut. I feel like I blow it and I blow it and I blow it and I talk to God and I blow it and I blow it and I feel like, God, you must be getting bored with me. You must think that I am just a bad person like an accident. I do not have my stuff together remotely. You ever feel that way? You ever feel embarrassed to pray? Sometimes I feel like, God, this is going to be pretty stupid. I feel stupid right now. I'm going to say the same thing I've been saying, like it might be news to God. And then we need this word, parasuo. It's way more than enough. It's way more lavish than we'll ever need. It's way more lavish than we could imagine or ask for. And everything we've ever done that we could ever want to call on, God's already had it in mind. I had an image this morning in prayer of just smoke of incense like coming out of a jar and filling a room. And it reminded me recently, just a month ago, I was back up at the Abbey I love so much in Villarmo, California. And I was there on a feast day. And on feast days, in the Roman Catholic tradition, in a formal Mass, they take incense, and they have an incense burner that hangs on a chain, and the priest will go through the congregation and swing the chain. And I was sometimes heard of churches with smells and bells as somewhat of a derogatory or weird term, like, oh, that's a smells and bells church. Oh, that's weird. I'm kind of glad I don't go to a smells and bells church. I don't really know what that would be like, but I hadn't actually been in an incense service to remember. But the priest went through and swung the incense, and then everybody just sat and inhaled the incense. And it is a reminder of God's presence with us and the grace of God that fills the room. And there was something about inhaling the smell that just sort of calls to mind in our whole body and being that God's grace fills and overflows our lives in the room. And I thought, if it's okay, we're just going to do a brief practice that goes way back, like 16, 17, 18 centuries. It's called a breath prayer. And it's just breathing in. A simple way to do it is to breathe in and to say to yourself, Jesus, and to breathe out and to say, I trust you with everything. To breathe in and say to yourself, Jesus, and to breathe out, say, you are Lord of all. Very simply. It's all right if you would just close your eyes. I have no incense burner. We might have one Christmas Eve, but no incense burner right now. But just imagine now God's grace filling the room and filling your body. And breathe in and say to yourself, Jesus. Breathe out, you are Lord of all. It's called a breath prayer. Breathe in, Jesus. I trust you with everything. Breathe in again, Jesus. Breathe out, you are Lord of all. It's a way to receive grace. If you find yourself this week really stressing about life, for some of us, this is a week where we're reminded that our family is not what we want it to be, or maybe it's not even there. And you could just sit by yourself and breathe in, Jesus, I trust you with everything. Or perhaps, Jesus, you are with me. For some of us, this is a week where we remember a lost one, a loved one who's not going to be with us. And you could breathe in and say, Jesus, and breathe out and say, I trust you, insert a name with my dear family member. It's just a practice of receiving grace, and it's a way to remember with our bodies that God's grace is lavish. We need God's grace not just in our minds, but to fill our hearts, and I think not just in our hearts, but to fill our bodies. We need God's grace to overwhelm us and to be poured over us. We need ways to engage God's grace. In the Eastern Church, if we were anywhere, in the old Russian republics, all of the Eastern Church practices this way of receiving grace virtually daily, and they have for many, many centuries. So God's grace is lavish, and then the last of the three words, God's grace is free, God's grace is lavish, and now let's move to Ephesians 2, 4-5. But because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive, powerful words, with Christ, even when we were dead in transgressions. It is by grace you have been saved. And so, in this verse, we see the power of grace. Like, grace brings life out of death. Grace isn't just like nice. It's different than kindness. It's different even than God's mercy. Grace is the power that brings life out of death. And so God's grace is powerful. When we think about grace, we think about life out of death, freedom out of slavery. God's grace is the power that breaks the consequences of sin in our lives. God's grace is what brings our souls to life out of that place of being distant and separated from God. And it's also the power that in a fresh way, time after time, explodes into our life, bringing us alive and bringing hope into our lives where we would be despairing otherwise. Last night we were at a party put on by our Love 146 task force, just a small group in conjunction with one of the few group homes that does aftercare for human trafficking victims in San Diego. There are 4 of those homes. Right now, we just found out there's 38 beds in our whole city. We hope to see that number go up. But at the end of the party, there were some gifts given to the women who are survivors of trafficking. And I just asked Renee's permission to tell this story. Renee, for each of these women, made a card, and it had, in really beautiful calligraphy, the name of the woman. And the card was folded, and when you opened the card, there was sort of the calligraphy continued, so the person's name turned into a very extravagant design. And she told each of the women, you may think a certain thing about yourself, but then when you open it up, you see that God may see you from a different perspective. And then there were scriptures on the inside and some stuff about the meaning of their name. Well, I had spent some time talking to one of the women, and I saw her receive the card and smile and say thank you, and then afterwards she kind of went off by herself and read it and just broke down weeping. And there was like a powerful impact that you could see, like of grace. This was unexpected, just a free gift, just a sign of God's love and God's mercy. But it was just breaking into reality right before our eyes. And as we headed out into the night, I shook her hand and said, it's just been so good to meet you and to talk to you. And through her tears, she said, and she speaks a little bit broken English, said to me an interesting phrase, "This is my best night. This is my best night." And I don't know what she meant. I hope it didn't mean the best night of her life. But I could tell it meant very, 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 very special. And I think it's a small picture of the power of grace. When we find out, in a way that we hadn't even been thinking about, I'm a loved person. When we find out in a way we haven't been thinking about, maybe there's a beauty in my life that I was unable to see. When we find out in a way that we've never been thinking about or imagined, the God who made everything sees me and cares for me and has loved me in a way that I don't think I even knew. It's the power of grace to transform, the power of grace to release the deepest pain in our lives. Well, I want to move from the story of God's grace to just a brief close on how can we live in a story of grace, because many of us have heard the message of grace. Many of us would at least associate grace as sort of a Christian-y word. But it's a different thing to live in a story of grace. And I think that we are in a culture that's absolutely thirsty for good stories. This is going to be my very last Star Wars touch point, I promise you. I promise you. The Economist ran a great article this week. 10 years ago, Disney was a divided company in total disarray, going nowhere and financially spiraling down. And they hired Bob Iger as the CEO of Disney, who came in and immediately started spending what everybody thought were ridiculous sums on other companies. He spent $8.4 billion to buy Pixar, which produces one movie a year. And everybody said, Bob, you are a maniac. It's a good company. It's not worth $8.4 billion. And then he spent $4 billion on Marvel and didn't even get the rights to their movies. And everybody said, Bob, that's not worth anything like that. Why did you pay $4 billion for Marvel? And then he paid $4.1 billion for Lucasfilms, which hadn't done anything in a long time. Everybody said, Bob, you have lost your mind. You're spending money your company doesn't have. And Iger's response is, I'm not paying for their stuff. I'm paying for their stories. And he took those stories and looped it back to and sort of reclaimed Disney as a storytelling company. And he said, we live in a culture thirsty for good stories, and I'm going to buy them. Disney has quintupled in value and is now worth $150 billion more than it was 10 years ago. Crazy. But what that says is, he was right? We're in a culture thirsty for good stories. Give me a good story. There's a lot of bad stories. And what Iger knows very blatantly and what Lucas knows is they're just telling myths, but they're at least good ones, pretty much, on average anyway. They sell. We need to live in life-giving stories, and better yet, in the reality of the world made by a loving God. And so I want to talk about, just briefly, living in a story of grace. And Ephesians gives us a couple important clues. For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. Here's the first thing about living in a story of grace, is that faith is the gateway into a story of grace. Right? Faith, that's the doorway in. How do I enter into a story of grace? The Bible's answer is faith. It's trust. There's a simple aspect of the story of Jesus that requires a fresh trust. Lord, can we trust you? I want to trust you that your word is true. One way faith ignites in my life is just reading God's word. This is sort of a simple suggestion, but if you haven't really in a fresh way read something like Ephesians, or this week you could read Luke 2, all of a sudden as I have been reading Ephesians, faith is just ignited. Your love is incomparably more than I would ask for, Lord. Okay, and all of a sudden something ignites in my heart. The Spirit brings faith, which, as the verse said, it's not something we make up, it's something God gives us, but that faith brings it alive, and all of a sudden, I'm empowered to live in a story of grace in a way that I wasn't 5 minutes ago. And I think we have to remember that we live right now at a time when everybody is trying to rewrite the story of life where faith doesn't matter. I just saw Stephen forward me an interesting article from Kentucky where there was a school that was taking sort of all the Bible verses out of the Peanuts Christmas episode. And the interesting thing to me is not, there's a whole argument over that, but the interesting thing is that the cultural move right now is to rewrite stories so that faith doesn't matter, so that everybody can jump into the story and it's like faith doesn't matter. But I think the reality is that faith actually does matter. And the reality is that the entrance to the story of grace is through faith. It's not through any other route. And the flip side of this, for it's by grace you've been saved through faith, and this not from yourselves, it's the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. And so this is simple, but I think deeply true. Works are the door out of a story of grace. And I don't mean just doing good things, but I mean the posture where we're trusting ourselves and our own goodness. Whenever mentally our framework is, I'm trusting myself, we are stepping out of the doorway of grace. And Paul will repeatedly say to the church in Ephesus and the church in Galatians, and really to all of us, that mentality that I'm okay in myself and that I can get it done and that I can live a good life is actually the antidote to everything God wants to do in my life. It actually disables all of God's power in my life. It's just like yanking the power cord out of the wall. And for me, the primary symptom of works in my life is criticism. That critical person at the party, for me, that's like the fever tells you that you have a virus. For me, criticism is one of those sure symptoms. Whenever I'm criticizing someone, I realize I'm stepping out of a story of grace right now. Wherever you find cynicism is just when criticism becomes a worldview, right? And we live in such a cynical culture. And in ways, it's fun to be cynical right now. I just saw Will Ferrell's spoof on the Republican national debate, and it was hilarious. It was the most cynical thing I've ever seen. It was utterly, thoroughly critical. I loved it. Because I'm like a fallen, broken person who enjoys, fun at other people's expense. That's another bad thing. It's just a bad human way to be. But the reality is that when we get in that sort of bitter posture, it's just a symptom. It's our mouth and our mind telling us what's happening in our heart. And I want to invite us to breathe in grace. I want to invite us to be a church family soaked in grace. I want to invite us to be a church family with grace for others, with grace for ourselves. I want to be a church family where we can really dwell in the presence of the gracious God, whose grace is so powerful that it pervades everything God is and does. Whenever we are around enjoying the presence of God, there is just an after effect of grace in our lives. Let's all stand. Worship team, if you guys want to come up. We're going to close with a song of worship. And as we do that, I want to go back to this verse. But because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ, even when we were dead in our transgressions. It is by grace you have been saved. And so, Lord, I just ask that you would let your grace come down now. Lord, I ask that you would fill us. Lord, I ask that you would drench our thoughts with your grace. Lord, I ask that you would fill our hearts until they overflow, till they abound with your grace. Just had a picture earlier of a person with a lot of just stress in their back. I think that anxiety in our lives that can sometimes take residence in our bodies is one of those symptoms, like being critical. It's a symptom that we are not living in a story of grace. Just want to invite you to receive grace in your bodies. So, Lord, as we worship now, by the power of your Spirit, would you bring your grace alive in us? Let's worship. Can I get the prayer team to come on up? Like a couple specific invitations for response this morning. If you have never really experienced the grace of God in a way that you could touch and identify, as we just read, the Bible suggests that faith is the doorway in. And if you feel like, I just don't have faith, then you're right in line with what the Bible already says, that that's a gift. And if you want the gift of faith, we would love to pray with you. And again, if you feel like it's just not something you have, then that just matches what Paul was already trying to say to us, that's not something we make up. That's something God gives. But we can't ask for it. So if you're in that place, we'd love to pray with you. If you're dealing with anxiety, if you're a person you're just feeling the stress of the holidays in your body, we would love to pray with you. And then just a last specific invitation. One of the songs we sang was Hark the Herald Angels Sing. And the guy who wrote that song, for many years, he was totally disillusioned with God, and he thought that church in his whole country had become completely boring and worthless. He was like really cynical about what I would like organized religion, church in general. And then he went to a meeting where his world was utterly rocked. His name was Charles. Just utterly rocked by the presence of God. He had never written songs before. He had never considered himself creative before. And after he was utterly rocked by God, he just started writing like crazy. One of the early songs he wrote was that song, Hark the Herald Angels Sing, just calling out the glory of God. But if you feel kind of disconnected, if you've become bored or even a little bit cynical in your faith, just encourage you to get prayer. Just encourage you to come up. Because we live in this long stream of people who have maybe drifted toward and maybe drifted way away from God. People who maybe got just utterly cynical about whether church even matters. And then all of a sudden God shows up and ignites something that cannot be contained. the Jesus we walk with and the Jesus we worship. Let's all hold hands across the aisles. We're going to close, and if you'd like prayer for anything mentioned or just anything at all, this is always like an open place to get prayer for whatever you would want to ask God for. Lord, we thank you for your lavish grace. Lord, would you help us to live as a community of grace, as a family of grace? Would you help us to be a people that receive your free, abundant grace in our lives? Would you help us to be a people who live with our lives just significantly centered on your cross, Lord? Would you pour into us and would you pour out of us your grace? Would you connect us to each other with grace? Lord, would you connect us to our city with grace, Lord? Would you help us to receive all the joy that your coming as a child means for us and for the whole universe? In your name, Jesus. Amen. God bless you guys. If you'd like prayer for anything at all, come on up. If you're headed out, have a great week, and if you're in town, join us Christmas Eve.